For the second panel, which is titled Assessing Democratic Resilience in East Asia, Russia, and Beyond, we will cover a different subset of issues and bring in more cases and countries. And I'm delighted to have our two speakers with us. First to go will be Ingu Hwang, who is an associate professor of the practice in the International Studies program and a faculty board member of the Asian Studies program at Boston College. His research and teaching focus on modern Korean history and politics, Cold War East Asian diplomacy, and the history of human rights and humanitarianism. His recent book is called Transnational Democratization, Human Rights in South Korea and U.S. Cold War Policy. And finally, batting cleanup will be my dear colleague, Professor Jerry Easter.
Your dear leader.
My dear leader. Right. Political science departments are also not democracies. Jerry has been a member of the Boston College faculty since the year 2000, teaching courses in comparative politics with a regional focus on Russia and Eastern Europe. His interests include the modern state, post-communist transitions, comparative political economy, and he is currently working on projects related to the comparative politics of policing and pre-modern politics. And he is the author of numerous books about Russian politics, economics, and society, including The Tsarina's Lost Treasure and The Last Stand of the Raven Clan. First to go, however, will be Ingu Hwang, and I welcome you to the floor.
Good afternoon. First of all, thank you, Jonathan, for inviting me to this invaluable meeting. I'd like to share some reflection on democratic resilience from the historical perspective of Korea and East Asia. And South Korea, along with Taiwan, represent one or two exemplary cases in which, by the end of 20th century, former colony could develop both democracy and modern economy. And less than a year ago, a short-lived coup attempt in South Korea called international attention to social and political strength of democracy. If you understand democratic resilience, I captured from the Class Center webpage, and today actually you gave more in-depth definition about democratic resilience. But quite similar, like you highlighted about elasticity and evolution, but if I keep the definition as a capacity of institutions and people to resist significant socio-economic and cultural political challenges to democracy, I think South Korea's recent turbulence may offer a critical vantage point. It will help rethink the challenges and opportunities that South Korea faces in democracy and also other parts of the world. So let me begin by briefly reviewing the dramatic event surrounding the coup attempt. So on December 3rd, 2024, President Yoon Suk Yeol declared martial law to eliminate his political opponents. And he labeled the critics and opposition lawmakers as anti-state forces. So this marked the first time that a democratically elected president mobilized troops and for the domestic political advantage. So this declaration triggered immediate resistance. Unarmed citizens rushed together outside the National Assembly and forming a human blockade and to prevent troop advancement. And also, some soldiers resisted orders, somehow passively, just delaying, and somehow actively, just refusing to comply. Within a few hours, 190 members of National Assembly passed a resolution to lift the martial law decree and forcing the Yoon to rescind and the order. 10 days later, the Assembly voted to impeach Yoon. And on April 4th, the Constitutional Court upheld the impeachment. In the snap election on June 3rd, and Lee Jae-myung of the Democratic Party was elected president. Since then, special prosecutorial investigation and trials continued. So my question is here, what enabled South Korean people to prevent this moment of democratic declining and backsliding and from turning into the total breakdown of democracy? So I'd like to call your attention to Korea's past to identify significant sources of democratic resilience. So first, South Korea's democratic resilience is rooted in a deeply institutionalized culture of democracy and human rights that began to take shape in the 1970s. So during the period, democratization movements emerged in response to President Park Chung-hee's increasingly authoritarian rule. And this democratization movement coincided with the global rise of human rights, norms, and politics, which South Korean activists encountered through their constructive engagement with international organizations, Amnesty International, World Council of Churches, as well as liberal internationalists on U.S. Congress. Importantly, rather than adopting Western human rights framework, these local activists monarchized these norms. They used these adapted norms to advocate for democratization and human rights protections within South Korea and also on the global stage. By the 1980s, democracy and human rights had become the unifying framework, and with the tentative alliance in the 1970s, workers, religious leaders, and student activists, and solidified into a powerful mass movement. In the 1987, this movement succeeded in pressuring South Korean authoritarian government to adopt a new constitution. This revised constitution mandated direct presidential election, reaffirmed the sovereignty of the people, and established the constitutional courts, marking a major turning point in the country's democratic transition. This institutionalization of democratic and human rights principles continued to shape Korea's protest culture. In the 1990s, democratic and grassroots organizations initiated building the institutional foundation for transitional justice on colonial and post-colonial atrocities, including the 1979 military coup and also subsequent political crackdown on people in Gwangju in 1980. Perhaps you might be familiar with the book, Hwang's book, Human Acts. And this pursuit culminated in the establishment of crucial institutions in the 2000s, that's National Human Rights Commission and Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Thus, South Korea's decades-long struggle against authoritarianism and its ongoing commitment to social justice and human rights helped cultivate civil society network and protest culture that enabled the large-scale mobilization of citizens and lawmakers to resist President Yoon's martial law decree. This historical legacy also fostered a deep public awareness. Threat to democracy can often arise within the society rather than external forces. This perspective reflected in a constitutional court ruling that declared Yoon's martial law and unconstitutional because it betrayed the people's trust in institutions. In addition to the speed of anti-martial law actions, I'd like to highlight one striking aspect of the 2024 protests, that is their nonviolent, peaceful, and orderly nature. This reflects a deep historical continuity. Democratic dissident leaders in the 1970s and 80s, such as Kim Dae-jung, were profoundly influenced by the philosophies Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr., particularly their emphasis on nonviolent resistance and civil disobedience. This tradition of peaceful protest continued into the post-democratization era, most notably 2016 and 17 candlelight demonstrations. Every weekend, 1 million or 2 million people gathered to impeach corrupt president. Building on the point about the institutionalization of democratic culture, it is important to examine how effectively the country's institution and legal framework protected democracy and human rights during the recent crisis. Like many other democracies, already explained in the previous session, around the world, South Korea faced intense political polarizations in recent years. The two dominant parties, the People Power Party and Democratic Party, they have increasingly villainized one another and to mobilize their support and ultimately result in very intense political gridlock. This toxic climate worsened after Yoon Suk Yeol's election in 2022, as he sought to consolidate power by appointing far-right figures to key government and military posts. Post-crisis investigations have implicated several of those officials in the military and martial law plan, also uncovered evidence of collusion between Yoon, his wife, and business and journalist Myung Tae-gyun, and also a religious cult called Unification or Moonies, to influence parliamentary and presidential elections. However, despite these reactionary schemes, Korea's institution held firm. The National Assembly acted as a crucial safeguard, not only blocking the martial law decree, but also managing extensive hearings on the incident, along with investigation by police and prosecutors, which laid the groundwork for the Constitutional Court's ruling. I would argue the institutional resilience highlights how far Korea has progressed since the 1970s and 80s. Back then, like many other East Asian nations, local democratic activists had to heavily rely on international organizations or U.S. Congress liberal internationalists to create leverage for domestic and international momentums. Thus, over half a century, South Korea had built robust democratic institutions capable of resisting internal threats to democracy without relying on international or foreign interventions. Finally, I want to highlight how President Yoon Suk Yeol attempted to use historical revisionism as a tool to undermine democratic values. From the outset of his presidential campaign, he expressed admiration for past authoritarian leaders, most notably Chun Doo-hwan, who was responsible for the 1980 massacre in Gwangju. And after taking office, Yoon administration collaborated with the far-right church groups to promote a narrative centered on anti-communism and patriotism, and economic achievement of former authoritarian presidents, while downplaying their use of violence, intimidation, and repression. However, this strategy largely failed. During the 1970s and 80s, pro-democracy activists had campaigned to reveal how authoritarian regimes manipulated public fear of communism and the perceived threat from North Korea to justify political suppression. Protesters such as citizens in Gwangju were often falsely labeled as North Korean infiltrators or communist sympathizers. In the post-democratization era, transition justice advocates continue to correct the historical record. and they accordingly manifested. The victims of state violence, including those killed in Gwangju, were not enemies of the state, but ordinary citizens who stood up for democratic principles. Thanks to those earlier campaigns, most citizens were skeptical of President Yoon's portrayal of his critics and opponents as anti-state forces. During the impeachment proceedings, universities in South Korea and abroad, including Boston College, and organized educational events to help young students understand this recent crisis in historical context. So, for example, campuses hosted screenings and discussions of a non-fictional film titled The Soldier Spring, which explored the South Korean struggle during the time of 1979 military coup. So these events ensure that South Korea's past continue to serve as a critical foundation for the democratic future. So let me conclude. So while President Yoon's martial law decree represented a serious democratic crisis, but it also revealed the strength and maturity of the Korean democratic system. Despite the deep political polarization, the country's protest culture, civil society network, and democratic institutions proved resilient enough to prevent a complete breakdown of democracy. Moreover, the crisis has sparked meaningful grassroots conversations about how to address political polarization, the rise of far-right extremism, declining public trust in institutions, and the misuse of investigation for partisan purposes. So these discussions reflect a continued commitment to ensure Korea's hard-won legacies of democratic achievements. Thank you for your attention.